Thank you, Victoria, and thanks for everyone for coming to hear my talk today. I'm going to talk about, as Victoria mentioned, my PhD, which I've luckily been just accepted last week for a book which will be out in September 2019, and I'm going to talk specifically about what happens to Great War veterans when they returned to Ireland. Today I'm going to focus on the south of Ireland, which later became the Irish Free State, and looking particularly at the Ministry of Pensions archive in London, and looking at two key arguments. Argument number one is when these men returned, of course, we know that the Anglo-Irish War and the Irish Civil War was occurring, and I argue that this severely compromised the rehabilitation of disabled Great War veterans. But then from 1923 onwards, I argue that the help and the financial help that the Ministry provided and the British Treasury provided to disabled Great War veterans was far more than people recognise today. So in 1916, with the lethal reality of industrialised warfare disabling men at the front on an unprecedented scale, the Ministry of Pensions, which I'll from here on in refer to as just the Ministry, it was established throughout the United Kingdom, throughout Britain and throughout Ireland, and it had three jobs, and that was to provide financial compensation, to provide medical treatment, and to provide a pension. So it had a headquarters in the middle of London, and like I said, it was funded by the British Treasury. And throughout the United Kingdom, it was divided into 13 regions. And in Ireland, the two regions were Ulster and South Ireland. And the two headquarters for those regions were in Dublin and in Belfast. And they were helped by hundreds of sub-branches and local committees which were dotted all around Ireland. So in 1921, there was around 100,000, we reckon, an estimate about 100,000 Great War veterans returned to the south of Ireland. Around this, about 37,500 were in receipt of a disability pension and were administered from this centralised hub in Belfast or Dublin. And around 40% of these were living in and around Dublin. And the Ministry paid at the time around £1 million and £50,000, which obviously at the time, 1921, is far more significant than that figure suggests. With regards to a pension, they were paid on the following scale. So the way you were provided a pension, the severity of your disability dictated the amount of your pension. So if you had a 20% disability, that was deemed to be quite a light disability where it didn't really impact on your employability and civil life too much. Whereas if you're in receipt of a 100% pension, you were deemed that you were totally disabled and you had very little chance of being reintegrated in society and very little chance of getting full-time employment. And just to give an indication, 100% pension was around 75% of the annual wage in the United Kingdom. So the Ministry of Pensions, the way it approached rehabilitating Great War veterans was, we are the state and we'll provide a pension and we'll provide treatment, but it's also society's job to provide employment. It was sort of like a two-pronged approach, state and society together. So as I've mentioned, in addition to providing a pension, the Ministry of Pensions also provided exclusive inpatient and outpatient treatment with Ministry of Pensions hospitals, again established throughout the 13 regions in UK and Ireland. And in 1921, 150,000 pensioners were in receipt of inpatient treatment. And this could be for a wide variety of disabilities induced by the war, so it could be bronchitis by gas poisoning, shell shock neurasthenia, missing limbs, facial reconstructive surgery. If you had any sort of war-related ailment, then the Ministry of Pensions would provide exclusive treatment. And this picture here is just one of the hospitals, which was Leopardstown Hospital in Dublin. And this provided treatment to shell shock neurasthenic veterans and provided really ahead of its time, decades ahead of its time, psychotherapeutic treatment, Freudian, Carl Jung style and psychoanalysis. And it was admitting men from working class backgrounds who before the war would never have received this sort of treatment. And this is a picture of, this is the living quarters of Leopardstown Hospital. And this is broadly akin to what we described today as cognitive behavioural therapy. However, in my PhD, and when I was looking at the Ministry of Pensions records, I tried to argue that when these men returned home to an Anglo-Irish War and then the Irish Civil War, that the way the Ministry of Pensions works in Ireland in comparison to Britain is severely compromised. and my research agrees with existing research, which suggests that when British men return from the various fronts in a British Army uniform and return to nationalist areas of Ireland, that they're stigmatised and suffer as a result of having served in the British Army. And I found several quotes to highlight this, but because I've only got 40 minutes to speak, I'm just going to cherry pick a few. And this is from March 1920, when the Ministry of Labour was a department in charge of helping to employ Great War veterans, whether that was just a general ex-service community. They didn't specifically have to be in a disability pension. But they wrote in 1920, since the signing of the armistice, the discharged and demobilised Irish soldier has been returning to Ireland, only to find that his own people have nothing but contempt to offer him for his patriotism and sacrifice, and he is denied the right to work or live in the country in which he fought. And this is repeated in the Ministry of Pensions archive, which just looked after the men in receipt of a disability pension. One of the leading officials who worked in the Dublin headquarters, which was the picture that I included before, he also wrote that these men are coming home with a disability and they're finding it hard to retain employment because their employers don't want to employ them because they'd fought in the British Army, or even if they didn't hold nothing against them, they were worried that it would affect customers or affect people who were already on the payroll. And this is agreed by ex-service charities such as the Irish Federation of Discharged and Demobilised Soldiers, and they said, and I'll quote directly, "The crime of having served in the British Army was sufficient grounds to merit such hostile treatment. The majority of the employers had no military or naval service and are members of political organisations which have openly expressed their hostility to ex-servicemen." Indeed, in my own research, I've came across correspondence wrote to the ministry from veterans who returned to South Ireland, and they articulate the belief that I'm being denied employment because I'd fought in a British Army uniform. And here, of course, I think it's also worth mentioning that employment was hard for everyone. It wasn't just disabled Great War veterans who were struggling. This was a time when economic recession and attempts to get employment were hard for all ex-servicemen and all men between the ages of 18 to 35, 40, shall we say. However, I would argue, and again it comes across in my research, is these difficulties that was apparent in Irish society was manifested and highlighted for the Great War veteran. So such was the difficulty in alleviating the serious and pitiful unemployment experienced by ex-servicemen. Sergeant Humber Wolff, a senior official at the Ministry of Labour, he considered that the general ex-service community who returned to the South should be treated the same as how a disabled veteran is treated in Britain. And I came across this quote quite early in my PhD, and I was really interested because I thought, if the general ex-serviceman returns to Ireland and isn't compared to the disabled Great War veteran in Britain, what about the actual Great War veteran in South Ireland who was actually disabled? Was it that he was disabled twice, once by his army service and then secondly by his literal disability? And it was this that I was trying to get into during my PhD. And again, it shows, in my research into disabled Great War veterans, I've argued that the antagonism that was shown towards British ex-servicemen during the Anglo-Irish War was extended to those in receipt of a disability pension. And just to quote directly from one local report in 1921, it said, quote, "A reaction took place in Dublin in this sense, that these men went off amidst applause and Godspeeds, but in the intervening period," which of course we know is the Easter Rising and the 1918 general election, the election of Sinn Féin, "but in the intervening period things happened in Ireland, and when these men came back disabled and broken down, in some cases they found that even their own relatives had changed their views on the war and public affairs, and matters were extremely uncomfortable for these unfortunate men. The public, in its resentment, is inclined to threaten the disabled man." And this comes up time and time again in regional ministry reports during this period. And they're saying that the hostility shown towards the general ex-servicemen is also extended to those in receipt of a disability pension. And it's under these circumstances that the Ministry of Pensions and Ministry of Labour realised that around about 1920, 1921, that the problems that are evident in Britain are even more severe in South Ireland. Because here it's worth revisiting that the Ministry of Pensions rehabilitation of a disabled Great War veteran, it wasn't just a treatment and a pension, it was also this idea of employment. The whole system was set up so a man would still be a full-time breadwinner. So if a disabled man returns to South Ireland and feels as if he can't be employed, then that really severely compromises the whole outlook of the Ministry of Pensions and how it was meant to work. Indeed, I've even found evidence of disabled Grey War veterans who receive an inpatient treatment being impacted by the war. For example, veteran William Mcgraw, he was actually killed in a ministry hospital in Cork in 1920, and he was undergoing inpatient treatment for a gunshot wound. And when you read into the report of how he died, it seems as if he was hit by a stray bullet by the British Army, who were engaged with the IRA. So he fought in the First World War, returned to Ireland, and was killed by the British Army. Indeed, it seems as if once men were admitted into these exclusive hospitals in South Ireland, the ministry were actually reluctant to discharge them because they thought that once these guys leave the hospital, they're in for a rough time. And this is just, again, one quote of many, which I could have included. So this is one. This is again from Leopardstown Hospital. That's the outside of the hospital of where the men were sitting. And with the possibility of action being taken by the neighbours on their returning home, which may make them in a worse condition than when they were admitted to hospital, the difficulties in this connection explain largely the aggravation in their condition, which frequently occurs after men have been discharged from hospital. As a result of this situation and ensuing lack of assistance and employment, they wrote that their actual condition and duration of their stay in hospital was believed to be very much affected by the present situation in Ireland. And indeed, when you're looking at the qualitative data here and also looking at quantitative data, it does appear that this sort of homecoming really has a drastic impact on the Ministry of Pensions treatment facilities. How the Ministry of Pensions records have survived the records, and I don't know why this is, not all the Ministry of Pensions records survived, but the ones with regards to mental illness, their survival records appears to be better than other disabilities. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about shell-shock veterans, but in the report, when the Ministry of Pensions are talking about shell-shock veterans, they say that the same principles apply to men in gunshot wounds and missing limbs and things like that. Because when we look at the data of waiting lists for men wanting treatment for shell-shock neurasthenia, there was around 65,000 throughout the UK. And this was pretty much any mental illness that wasn't severe enough to be admitted into an asylum. It was a very umbrella term for anxiety, depression, things like that, hallucinations. You can quite clearly see that the waiting lists in South Ireland were far higher than any of the other 12 regions in the United Kingdom. And the Ministry of Pensions, actually, when they set up the inpatient facilities, they said we should never have a difference of more than 5% between the 13 regions. But then clearly when you put in the data, you can clearly see that the waiting lists in South Ireland are far higher than anywhere else. And by 1921, the Ministry of Pensions realised that the situation in South Ireland is far more precarious than the situation in Britain. And Dr. Forward, one of the leading officials in South Ireland, he says, if you want to cope with this waiting list figures, it's not enough to build 100 new hospitals. The lack of hospitals isn't the problem. The problem is when these men are discharged, because of the reception on the outside and because they can't get in treatment, because they can't get employment and because they're feeling almost threatened, then the lack of treatment isn't the problem. It's the reception. And crucially, even the ministry think, well, until the situation in Ireland resolves itself, we're not going to invest any sort of capital or any further infrastructure in Ireland until the situation sorts itself out. And it's this observation which is important. Because again, Dr. Forward, he's not saying build another 10 hospitals. He's saying you could have as many hospitals here as you want. The problem is society outside of the hospital walls. And literally adding insult to injuries when the officials, the top brass officials in London realise these waiting list figures are so much higher in South Ireland, and they blame the victim. They say, well, it's the Irish, they're naturally predisposed to mental illness. And that's a continuation, I think, the talk before about the Irish famine and this idea of blaming the victim. It comes up. That was an opinion of the men in London, not the British civil servants in Dublin, who, you get a sense from the record, realised that it wasn't the Irish veterans' fault. I think when you're outside of Ireland, the officials sort of look over there and go, that's the Irish for you. Yeah. And what's really interesting as well, so the Ministry of Pensions, which operates in Belfast and Dublin, provides home visits throughout the whole of Ireland. It treats men in the homes throughout Ireland. It assesses them in the homes throughout Ireland, or even local community halls and things like that. But because of the Anglo-Irish War and the guerrilla conflict, the Commissioner of Medical Services in South Ireland, he actually tells his staff that don't go out there because we can't guarantee your safety. And just again to quote directly from him, he says, "The daily position at present does not justify an officer," and by that he means a Ministry of Pensions official, "risking his own life in doing outdoor work or work where he is not known in Ireland, as in all cases. Strangers are regarded with suspicion and may be shot on sight through no fault of their own." And indeed, reading the Ministry of Pensions archive throughout Ireland, they do mention, when you're working and operating around Ireland, it is quite a dangerous place to work. Just to include the Inspector of Artificial Limbs, and he was from Belfast, and he would go across Ireland to make sure men's artificial limbs were working well and whether any adjustments were needed. And he wrote, "Every time I go to Dublin, I seem to be near ambushes or shootings of kinds, which of course mean considerable personal risk." End quote. And in total, there's 11 separate instances of actual damage to ministry's property or staff across Ireland were reported during the conflict. But more than the 11 instances themselves, you get a sense that the staff were really worried about being in Ireland at this time. These British civil servants. And the situation actually reaches a climax in 1921, when ministry staff say, "We're not leaving our office to go and visit these men unless you can guarantee our family will have a life insurance payout." So with all these conditions in mind, Dr. Forward, who again is one of the leading officials for the Ministry of Pensions working in South Ireland, he reports back to his London superiors, and he describes the Ministry of Pensions operations in South Ireland as being in a, quote, "very unsatisfactory state." And it's my own view that this is typical Oxbridge civil service understatement. You get a sense that reading from the records, if it was me, I'd be effing and blind and saying, "Get over here and sort this out," because it seems as if it's complete chaos. And, there was problems in Britain, but the problems in Britain, administrative problems, were nothing compared to what was happening in Ireland. And just to give an example of the problems, one of the things that the Ministry of Pensions did for ex-servicemen were, if they suffered from mental illness enough to needed to be admitted into an asylum, the Ministry of Pensions would pay for them to be treated as an asylum patient, and in the asylum they could wear their own military uniform. And in a district asylum, that was the veterans' way of saying, "Yes, I'm insane, but I'm insane because of the war, not because I've got, faulty genes like you have." Which is how, unfortunately, how mentally ill people were treated at the time. There was this idea that if you were mentally ill, it wasn't because of what you'd been through, it was because you were predisposed. It was because you were bad stock. However, there's a 2-year delay in Ireland of this scheme. So it's introduced in Britain in 1917, but it's not introduced in Ireland until 1919. And one of the reasons it's not introduced is because they worry that these ex-servicemen, being a minority population in a district asylum in their own uniform, that could lead to problems with staff and pauper lunatics. Again, it speaks to this idea of anti-British sentiment. It's so pervasive that the ministry worried about, these insane veterans who were in the asylum. And also because the magistrates and the police were so concerned with dealing with the IRA and Republican commitments. Even things such as admitting men to the asylum through the Dangerous Lunacy Act, even that was difficult just through, the resources were tied up with the Anglo-Irish War and not admitting men under the Dangerous Lunacy Act. And in 1921, the ministry wrote, "It seems to be nobody's business that these men go to the asylums," end quote. And just through sort of reading what isn't in the evidence as well as what is, it seems as if a lot of men who were suitable for being institutionalised were sort of looked after by family members in the home who were unable to process these men going into the asylum. So here looking at South Ireland, which I try and argue appears to be a unique case in Southern Ireland. I'm going to talk a little bit about Ulster because even in the north it appears that disabilities in the First World War doesn't spare a veteran from the sectarian animosity that was occurring during the period. So in Ulster, the equivalent to Leopardstown Hospital was Craigavon Hospital, and again this offered progressive CBT treatment to mentally ill veterans. And during the widespread sectarian, this is 1920, I think it was the summer, I should have wrote the month because I can't think of it on the top of my head, but there was death threats sent to Catholic patients from Protestants, and pretty much saying if you don't leave this hospital, then we're going to get you, sort of thing. And 20 out of the 26 Catholic patients, it was around a 90-bed hospital, actually discharged themselves against medical advice. In the superintendent of Craigavon Hospital, as you can see, one of the quotes, he said, "Probably the threats are not really of a very serious character from a purely psychological point of view, but when conveyed to ex-servicemen suffering from shell shock, they are of a most cowardly character and unfortunately produce a great effect on the individual," end quote. And one of the most frustrating things about my research is the records of Craigavon and Leopardstown haven't survived. So again, you've got to rely on these top-down records to sort of, paint a picture. But this idea of being in a shell-shocked hospital for mental illness and getting a death threat through, it just makes, you can't help but think that would make a lot of sense if these mentally ill men conditions were worsened. So this incident was published in the press, in the local press in and around Belfast, and actually Protestant patients also received a similar retaliatory threat, but no Protestant patient discharges themselves. They were appearing not to take it seriously. So I try and argue in my PhD and in my upcoming book that the situation in Ireland was bad. But that's not to suggest that the situation in Britain was, seamless and worked really well, because it quite clearly didn't. The Ministry of Pensions had the same problems of finding men employment, and veterans also agitated for better pensions, better medical treatment, better medical facilities. But it seems as if veterans in Britain had a far better societal reception than veterans in the south of Ireland and more nationalist areas. So one way that the Ministry of Pensions tries to make up for its shortcomings in rehabilitating the Great War veteran is to introduce a thing called the King's National Roll. And this is a British state programme. It's entirely voluntary, and it encourages employers in the public and private sector to ensure that at least 5% of the workforce are in receipt of a disability pension. And it's launched in Britain in September 1919. And this is today what we call corporate social responsibility, where if an employer took part in the scheme, they could advertise it in all of the correspondence saying, by the way, we're part of the King's National Roll. And it was this idea of, a national repayment to disabled Great War veterans for the sacrifices. And previous historians who've looked at this system in Britain have said that it's been, as you can see in one of the quotes, Deborah Cohen describes it as an indisputable success, as it was employed around 300,000 disabled ex-servicemen annually in Britain. However, unfortunately in Ireland, in both the north and the south, it's not employed during the Anglo-Irish War. Again, it's this idea where people don't seem to want to intervene too much until the situation resolves itself. But then even after the Anglo-Irish War, in the Irish Free State, the trade unions resist it. And it's implemented in Northern Ireland to reasonable success. So ultimately, with a whistle-stop tour of my first two chapters of my PhD, I've aimed to demonstrate how the unique situation of Southern Ireland veterans in receipt of a disability pension, returning to a home where not only is the service not appreciated, but by some the thought to have fought in an army that's now considered to be the enemy. And this is unique to the United Kingdom. And retrospectively, like we mentioned before, when you think of what we know now about post-traumatic stress disorder in the aftermath of the Vietnam War, you can't help but speculate on what sort of psychological implication this must have had, especially for men in receipt of a disability pension for a mental illness. Again, though, because we know far more today than they knew, there is an absence of evidence where you can sort of try and work this out, but you can't help but think what may have been. So unfortunately, I try and argue that, not try and argue about it, My first two chapters are really, excuse the pun, quite depressing. There's really not many nice, uplifting moments. It's not the happiest of subjects, which is one of those things. But I'm going to talk a little bit now about what happens after the Anglo-Irish War, and hopefully things will make it a little bit more cheerful. If not, totally hunky-dory. So, with the Anglo-Irish War, when the British government and Republican forces realised that, this war is a bit of a, it's the likelihood of an outright winner is quite small, and it comes to like a compromise settlement with the Anglo-Irish Agreement. The ministry actually said if this, no matter what happens, that conditions in Ireland will improve in the near future, but it seems very questionable, even if the country becomes settled again, whether the ex-soldier will not be regarded still as an outcast and an undesirable by his fellow man, owing to the present hostile attitude which is directed collectively and individually against men who served in the war. And again, in my research, I found that the Ministry of Pensions actually continue to term themselves an imperial obligation in the country. So even when the Free State and Northern Ireland is established, the Ministry of Pensions really operate as if nothing had happened. They continue to operate with instructions from London, and they continue to operate with the funding of the British Treasury. Now, under the Transfer of Function Order, one of the key agreements of the Anglo-Irish Treaty and the establishment of the Irish Free State was the British government ensured that anyone who'd served in the British forces, including disabled Great War veterans and disabled Great War veterans, wouldn't be discriminated against because of the form of service. And reading the records during this time, when the Anglo-Irish Treaty was signed, you get a sense that Ministry of Pension staff are really worried about what's going to happen. They said that this establishment of a free state, and letting the Republicans, even if it is a compromise solution, letting the enemy take over, so to speak, we have no idea what's going to happen. There's no guarantee that the British ex-servicemen will be safe. Indeed, they even worried that having the Ministry of Pensions remain in Ireland and funded by the British Treasury, that is actually ammunition for people who don't support the Irish Free State and don't support the treaty. And again, it's that idea of links between Britain and Ireland. And here it's worth interesting to note that in order to deal with the anti-treaty IRA, the Free State government quickly assembled an army of approximately 60,000 men. And it was these men in the 1920s and 1930s who received preferential treatment from the government, and not First World War veterans who received preferential treatment with things such as treatment in the civil service and public employment and things like that. Yet what's also interesting is that around 50% of the National Army consisted of British ex-servicemen. And historians have said if it wasn't for these veterans who returned from the First World War, who then enlisted in the Free State Army, then there's no, they were a key part of, the Irish Civil War and the Free State Army's victory. However, quite literally, if you were in receipt of a disability for mental illness or a physical disability, you were debarred from enlisting in the frontline service. So even this chance of redemption was denied to disabled Great War veterans. And what's also interesting is the amount of Great War veterans who came home and enlisted in the Free State Army. It didn't go unnoticed by the by the anti-treaty IRA. And in March 1922, the main ministry office in Cork was actually set ablaze by anti-treaty IRA forces. And they set it on fire because they wanted to totally destroy administration of the Ministry of Pensions in the region. An anonymous letter was received by the secretary of the Cork branch on the following day, and it wrote, quote, "Let Michael Collins, as bodyguard of ex-servicemen, put it out this time. They will lose their blood money for a bit as their records go up in flames, the dirty lot," end quote. So here we see that even though disabled Great War veterans aren't enlisting in the Free State Army, because their ex-comrades, able-bodied ex-comrades are, then the anti-treaty IRA are taking it out on the Ministry of Pensions and taking it out on the disabled Great War veteran. The secretary of a local pensions committee in County Leitrim was also shot dead during the conflict. And Leopardstown Hospital, which I mentioned before, that was actually raided twice by anti-treaty IRA for medical supplies and money and courts and things like that. So, of course, as we know, the Irish Free State forces came out on top. And after the cessation civil war, previous research suggests that once the Irish Civil War ends, that the Free State government and Free State society doesn't discriminate against the Great War veteran. The most recent book was by a man called Paul Taylor, and that was in 2015. And his thesis aligns itself with an official report by the Free State government in 1928, and they say that British Great War veterans aren't discriminated against in the Irish Free State. They're just like any other member of society. And whilst whilst during the Anglo-Irish period I found clear examples of ex-servicemen being discriminated against or feeling hostility, there's much less from 1922 onwards, but I don't think that is enough to overlook instances of stigma and discrimination completely. And even the 1928 report, which was set up by the Free State government, they said most of our report is in urban centres, and what's going on in isolated areas in Ireland, there's no way we can comment on who is and isn't being discriminated against. And indeed, reading the records of the Ministry of Pensions, they argue that in more nationalist areas of Ireland, such as the western areas, then that is where more instances of employment discrimination and societal reception is less favourable than maybe Dublin or Cork. And in my own research, I've came across significant examples of accusations of discrimination against the British ex-servicemen in the private sector. But again, it's this idea, the Ministry of Pensions agree. They say it's very hard to come up with a hard and fast rule of how veterans are treated. It's a very subjective. It depends on the employer, the region, the town, the village. It's very hard to pigeonhole it into, a sentence or a paragraph. And again, it's this idea of silence during the 1920s and 1930s where, actually picking up the voice of the veteran is quite difficult. So again, looking at Ireland, it's not to suggest that the situation in Britain was perfect, because by 1929 we see that almost 60% of unemployed men in Britain were Great War veterans. But again, in the Irish Free State, all the problems that seem to exist in the reception of Great War veterans in the Free State are magnified. Because of the lack of societal sympathy and a government which favours Free State veterans over the British Army veteran of the First World War, Great War veterans join the rest of society in, it's not that they were discriminated against by the government and by society at large, it's just that they weren't cared about and they weren't appreciated. In June 1936, one Ministry of report from Dublin best summarised the predicament, and they wrote, "In general, while there is no sympathy for the ex-serviceman as such, there is no boycott. Difficulties do not spring from his war service, but are indigenous to the economic conditions of the country in which he lives, and are shared by all members of the same community." End quote. And here it's worth pointing out that the Free State economy at the time, a lot of men were unemployed, especially Great War veterans, who by and large didn't have any qualifications and were sort of at the bottom of the employment ladder when they returned home. So again, British ex-servicemen who returned to Britain, again, struggle from being able to attain employment. But not only is the King's national role employed in Britain, there also seems to be more charitable help and philanthropic help for the veteran in Britain in comparison to Ireland. So like today, during the interwar period, the leading charity who helped on behalf of the Great War veteran was the British Legion. And they helped with things such as representations to the ministry, sorting out employment training, sorting out work experience, even private donations just to see people through the hardest of times. In 1926, the British Legion in Northern Ireland conducted a review of conditions in the neighbouring Free State and concluded, "In many parts, the men are afraid to identify themselves with the Legion, for acknowledging themselves as ex-servicemen means speaking generally unemployment. The position of ex-servicemen is pitiable and extreme, and described the problem of the ex-servicemen as one of the greatest problems in the empire." And again, they're talking there about general ex-servicemen, not those in receipt of a disability pension. Indeed, when you read the records of the British Legion in London, very rarely do they mention Ireland, the Free State, and when they do mention the Free State, it appears as if the concern for veterans in the Free State isn't top priority as maybe Manchester, London, and places like Glasgow were. There's examples of them constantly missing meetings with the ministry and constantly running out of the relevant forms to help men pursue claims to the ministry. And indeed, in the Free State, it had the lowest numbers of men actually become members of the British Legion, with only 3 to 10% of the ex-service community joining. What's interesting is, in the absence of a committed legion, the Southern Irish Loyalist Association, it appears to try and take on the helm as being the friend of the ex-serviceman in place of the British Legion. And the Southern Irish Loyalist Association, it's a charity that's been overlooked in the historiography and really needs a lot more research, which thankfully Brian Hughes, who's also speaking at the festival, he's looking into at the moment. So in addition to the British Legion, there was also the Ex-Service Welfare Society. And this charity is, to date, known as Combat Stress, and it's the leading charity in Britain which looks after veterans of post-traumatic stress disorder. Obviously, a lot of the men who served today would have been Iraq, Afghanistan, Northern Ireland, Falklands. But it was actually set up in the aftermath of the First World War to look after shell-shocked and mentally ill veterans. And again, reading its annual report, it mentions that more help's needed for British shell-shocked veterans, but the situation in Ireland is even worse. And again, just to cherry-pick 2 quotes. The first one from 1928, it writes, "A great number of applications for help have been received from Ireland." And when it says Ireland, it means the Free State. For the Empire, but are now existing in abject poverty. And 3 years later, cases from Ireland have again, this year, been very numerous, due no doubt to the distress in the country. So as I've mentioned, unlike the revolutionary period where I've found clear instances of men feeling hostility and examples of action being taken against ministry officials and a fear of hostility amongst veterans, I have found evidence of stigma being attached to the ex-servicemen, but less outright instances of men being denied employment or attacked purely on their ex-service in the British Army. But again, this idea of stigma is very hard to quantify. How do you quantify how someone is stigmatised or not? It's one of those historiographical problems. But generally, I try and argue that apathy appears to be the overriding emotion in the Free State. Again, it's not that they were discriminated against, it's that they weren't cared about. Sort of laissez-faire principle. And this is why the King's national role and trade union resistance in the Free State stops the King's national role being implemented in the Free State. And in June 1936, one ministry official stated, quote, "The disabled ex-servicemen have not the general and wholehearted support which is enjoyed by their comrades in Great Britain. There is no King's role, no wide appeal to public sympathy, backed by church nor state." And if I could summarise the 3rd chapter of my PhD, it would be in the following quote. And this is the Ministry of Pensions writing in 1936, and they are writing from Dublin back to their superiors in London. And they wrote, "He suffers from a sense of inferiority and helplessness born from his isolation from England and the apathy and lack of interest that surround him. The Irish Free State refused to regard itself as having participated as a nation in the Great War and has repudiated responsibility for the cost of its after effects. Every Southern Irishman who enlisted did so as a volunteer, and each individual must either bear responsibility for his results of his voluntary act or look to his employer, the British government, for redress." And one really striking line was this one when it said, "The Great War and its aftermath does not enter the ethical conscience of the Free State, with the result that those who suffered by volunteering their service excite neither interest nor sympathy." End quote. And here again, I think it's worth revisiting this idea, what we know today about returning veterans, especially in the aftermath of Vietnam, and what we know today about post-traumatic stress disorder. You can't help but again speculate of what sort of psychological impact did this homecoming have, where it was this isolation of veterans and not being appreciated by society and the government. Even things such as, again, looking at contemporary trauma theory, this idea that one of the key ways to reintegrate a veteran into society is to appreciate his sacrifice, to not celebrate his service, but to acknowledge that his service was worth the sacrifice, and what he went through was worth, the shattered minds and the lost comrades X, Y, and Z. But again, looking through Ireland in the 1920s and 1930s, even things such as armistice days, even though very often well attended, often impacted by sporadic instances of such as smoke bombs and disruption, people trying to put a stop to them, even if it's such things as, smashing the instruments of a local band. So I was going to play a video here, but I'll move quickly on, because although I've tried to argue that the reception of Great War veterans was much less suitable in the Free State than in Britain, it's actually within this homecoming where if you put the quantitative data of what happens to veterans in the Free State in comparison to Britain, both in terms of cost of pensions per year and the percentage of favourable decisions in pensions appeals, you're far more likely to be successful in the Free State than anywhere else in the United Kingdom. And this is something that I'm trying to engage with before the book comes out and try and get a reason of why this is. But it appears that the two key theories that I'm trying to engage with at the minute is, it appears that when men are applying for a pension and medical treatment in the Free State, because the Free State staff know that their reception outside of the walls of the ministry is so unfavourable, that they could be more likely to give a favourable decision to a veteran in comparison to the treatment of a veteran in Britain. And what's also interesting is, from 1922 onwards, the British Ministry of Pensions in Britain constantly try and get people off its pension roll, refuse people treatment, and try and cut costs throughout the interwar period, whereas in the Irish Free State, the costs actually rise each year. So you've got the Ministry of Pensions costs in Britain going down, and in the Irish Free State, it goes up. What's also interesting, again, something I'm hoping to engage with more, it seems as if Irish politicians know that there's a source of income coming. And if people come to what we obviously describe as surgeries and men say, I haven't got a job and I'm unemployed, they'll very subtly say, have you tried the Ministry of Pensions? And even one, P.W. Shaw, who was an Irish politician, and he was a very frontline politician who advocated on behalf of the veteran. Apparently his catchphrase was, the more pensions we get, the better it is for this country, end quote. But again, big problem, methodological problem is studying Great War veterans is, even though these collective records have survived, the individual records, very few Irish records have survived. I've accessed about over 100, and I've only been able to get about 5 where the men actually returned to Ireland. So it's something that I'm trying to research more before the book comes out. Leopardstown Hospital continues until the 1970s. It kind of becomes a de facto hospice, and some Great War veterans who received treatment in the facility during the interwar period actually see out the final days in Leopardstown in the 1970s, still in receipt of a disability pension. So my research stops in 1939, so how the Second World War impacts on Ireland and how the Second World War impacts on First World War veterans, I'm not too sure, but I do know that the Ministry of Pensions continued paying a pension and providing treatment to disabled Great War veterans even as the Free State becomes a republic, and even goes until the 1970s and 1980s. But just to finish on, the National Free State Army, even though they were treated better in terms of employment and societal by the Free State government rather, and IRA veterans which were taken in as the 1920s and 1930s in national mythology in the post-WW2, they don't recognise mental illness as a pensionable offence. So you have IRA veterans and Free State Army veterans in the asylum in the interwar period, and because mental illness isn't recognised by the Ministry of Pensions, they don't receive a pension. Similarly, a pension isn't as monetary in terms of a financial, isn't as significant and as helpful as the Ministry of Pensions. So again, it's this idea that even though these men have been forgotten in national historiography, I'll try and argue that they actually weren't forgotten by the British state during their own lives. And yeah, I'll finish there. Thank you very much.